Hello, and it is a pleasure to introduce to everybody our new project, the new project of the Homo Ludens Foundation, which is called Theater Dialogues. And I'm very happy that our first guest is Professor Marvin Kарлsъn, a distinguished professor of the City University of New York, and a scholar of theater scholar of staggering achievement. Welcome to our talk. And before I say just a few words about Professor Marvin Kарлsъn, just let me introduce also my colleague and myself, the people who will be doing this talk. Professor Николай Йорданов, who is also a theater researcher and theatrologist, professor at the National Academy of Theater and Film Arts, and theater historian. And I am Asen Terzиев. I'm also a theatrologist, associate professor of history of European theater at the National Academy in Sofia. Professor Marvin Kарлsъn is a scholar of staggering achievement. He has written so many books which have been translated on various languages, and some of them have been concerned with the theater history. I would like to mention some of the most important titles, which again, I hope that someday we may read in our language too, but starting from his debut book, The Theater of the French Revolution in 1966, Goethe and the Weimar Theater from 1978 book, which was of great importance for me, where he presents the figure of Goethe, but from the point of view of the theater, and we see a great description of this artist, but as a theater director, not just as the great writer who we know. Also, the Italian stage from Goldoni to D'Annunzio from 1981, Voltaire and the theater of the 18th century from 1998, and also apart from the historical books, there have been a lot of writings concerned with the contemporary stage, because Marvin Kарлsъn is also a researcher, a traveler who has visited a lot of countries, has been a jury to a lot of festivals. And he has been a contemporary and has seen with he has experienced by himself with his own eyes some of the works of the most important figures of the contemporary stage. If I cite just two examples from the United States of America, the Wooster Group or the Mabu Mines. But I would like to make a special stress on there are two books which have written by Marvin Kарлsъn, which have been of great importance, translated into many languages, and have been very influential. They are The Theories of the Theater, first published in 1984, and it has many editions, but in 1993 it had its expanded edition. And the other survey, which is called Performance, A Critical Introduction, from 1989. These two books were one of the reasons why we wanted to make this special talk with him, because they problematize two very important notions and ideas about the theater in the contemporary world. In a while, I will invite Professor Kарлsъn to expand more about them. I would just like to say that it seems like the notion of theater and theatricality on one hand, and the notion of performance and all the derivatives from it, performativity, etc., on the other hand, have become very popular, very topical, and in the beginning they seemed as if they are enriching and opening new sides to each other, trying to expand our understanding about the theater. But on the other hand, and they have been they have enjoyed a great modern usage. We could say like that the idea of theatricality has begun from the beginning of the previous century, but the popularity of these terms is clearly from the second half of the 20th century. And nowadays, for example, the word performance keeps entering also in the Bulgarian language, and it actually produces quite a lot of confusion sometimes and trouble, because performance translated into Bulgarian can mean a great variety of things, not only in the terminological usage of it. I believe we shall talk about that too. My first question, and to give the floor to Professor Kарлsъn to expand a little bit more about this, is why these two terms, why these two ideas, theatricality and performance, have become so important about how we think theater today, and are they notions which complement each other, or on the contrary, they are canceling each other?
Thank you for that gracious and comprehensive introduction. Let me just, to begin with, pick up on something you said about that my interest in the theater for my whole career has been partly an academic interest, but much more important, a phenomenological interest of actually experiencing the living theater. And the more I travel and the wider my experience is, the more joy I find in the theater, and the richer I find the possible experience. I have seen some theater in Sofia. I'd love to see more. I saw a wonderful production of Twelfth Night in Sofia a number of years ago. I look forward to coming back again, and it's delightful to be here, at least virtually, with you today. I think that now I have a 10-minute lecture written here. However, I think that since your introduction was widespread and your questions provocative, what I would rather do is simply respond to your questions, and we can then develop on from that. If you'd like me to read my prepared statement, I will be happy to do that. But let me just begin by responding to your question and see where that leads us. You asked, your question had to do with the very great popularity of these two terms, performance and theatricality, especially performance. And it is striking, I have found, that not only all over Europe, but indeed all over the world, in South America, in the Arab world, in China and Japan, the English word performance has spread in the last 15 or 20 years internationally, and has been extremely influential, but also extremely confusing, partly because whenever you move a word from one language to another, it takes on different perspectives. It means several different things, or even more commonly, several different words are necessary in the other language to begin to suggest what it is. In a way that has been, obviously that's caused a lot of confusion and a lot of debate about the term. But I would have to say that one of the reasons that performance became so useful a word in English is that even in English, performance means many different things. And it's useful, it has been very useful to theorists to be able to spread out the term and allow it to do a number of different things. Just to suggest the major way that this works is that, of course, basically the term performance and to perform has to do with human action. We perform. It is a word that's closely related to just to do something, or even the theater term to act is to perform. often in English we speak of actors as performers. However, there is also another related set of meanings that you find in things like in television advertising in the United States. You might hear somebody say, "This automobile performs very well." Or a teacher might say, "Your child is performing well in school." Now, that doesn't mean that they are doing anything like what an actor is doing. Certainly, the idea of an automobile or a machine performing, which we speak of, obviously there's nothing of the consciousness that is involved with a human being performing. We also talk about performing animals. And all of these have a kind of metaphorical connection through different kinds of action. But even in English, theorists have taken advantage of the fact that performance means a very wide range of things. So it's not at all surprising that when performance moves in, the term moves into French or German or Mandarin or Bulgarian, then the meanings proliferate, and that makes it much more difficult. So this is only just kind of an elaboration on your thoughts about how both an advantage and a disadvantage of this term is its flexibility and the fact that it spreads out over a very large area. What performance has allowed theorists to do in the English language is to broaden in a number of important ways the whole concept of theater. Traditionally in English, and for that matter in Western thought, theater has been very much associated with a particular tradition going all the way back to the Greeks of placing on the stage literary texts. And by and large, when people studied theater, traditionally, they studied the history of the presentation of those literary texts. How did Shakespeare's plays work on the stage? How did Moliere's plays and so on? When performance came along, it challenged some very basic assumptions of that model. And the most important one was the literary bias of it. That is, when you think traditionally, when you think of what is the most basic example of theater, it would be presenting on a stage a play of Shakespeare. But the performance people said, but what if there isn't a play? What about a parade or a festival? What about a clown show? What about a circus? Aren't these theater as well? And they said, all right, if theater is what you do when you put a Shakespeare play on the stage, we need a broader term that would include that kind of theater, but would also include these other things that are obviously connected to theater. And so performance allowed them to talk about that. That is, traditional theater people would say, oh, no, we can't count festivals or rituals or parades or for that matter political conventions, or for that matter wrestling matches or games and sports. But performance people said, but all of these things have certain of the same elements. Sometimes they have costumes. Sometimes people play particular roles. They pretend to be something they're not, and so on. And so performance allowed theater people to begin looking at the theatrical or theater-like qualities in a lot of other activities. And then, of course, when sociological and social science theorists began thinking about this term, they pointed out, well, even in everyday life, we do perform. That is, right now, I am performing. I'm wearing a costume. I'm wearing a tie, a jacket. I am performing the professor. I have a setting around me and so on. And the sociologist pointed out that the roles that you play when you're a doctor or a waiter or a professor, these are also roles. Sometimes people are very conscious of them, and sometimes they do it more unconsciously. But you can also talk about the performative aspect of this. We perform our lives. Now, this is something that theater people never really, well, I can't say they didn't think about it. Shakespeare certainly thought about that when he says all the world's a stage, all the people are merely players. There's always been something of an awareness of this in the theater, but theater scholars have never really thought about it. Probably the first modern theorist that really thought about this was the Russian theorist Nikolai Yevraimov, who did very interesting work in this area. So theater performance allowed people who were interested in this kind of human activity to not only look at related matters that theater had not really looked at, that is, like circus, puppetry, folk entertainment, ritual dance, and so on. But this also allowed them to move outside the Western tradition and look at things that are not theater, but are certainly performance in Africa, in Southeast Asia. Indeed, the whole Eastern traditions of theater in Korea, Japan, China are much better understood if you don't look at them with a literary orientation, but with a performance orientation. And so both geographically and structurally, performance allowed theater scholars to look at a much broader range and a much more, if I may say, democratic range. It's not just high literature you're talking about, but all kinds of folk entertainment as well. Now, that's I haven't said anything about theatricality, but maybe I ought to pause here a moment and ask if this raises any questions you would like me to pursue before I go on and talk a little bit about theatricality.
Okay. Professor Kарлsъn, you were so generous to allow us to translate one of your articles, Post-Dramatic Theater and Post-Dramatic Performance. In it, you are asking for a more nuanced and complex understanding of the term post-dramatic, which should go beyond the simple denial of the mimetic in favor of the performance or performative. How does, in your view, the concept of the post-dramatic expand or problematize our understanding of theatricality?
Thank you. It's a very important question. I would say that I am very pleased that you have an alternative. Does it expand or does it problematize or does it do both? To be honest, I think that the more important term is problematize, because there is a danger that post-dramatic does not expand, but confines to some extent. And let me explain. Like all critical or theoretical terms, post-dramatic, like performance, has a history. I mean, it began to be used by certain people in certain contexts, and that affects subsequent use, even though any time a new critical term appears, and especially when it begins to be translated into other languages, its meaning constantly changes and expands. So that, I mean, this inevitably happens. Take even a simple term, well, comparatively simple, like the theater of the absurd. What does theater of the absurd mean? Well, it means more and more things as it's used, and it becomes really a cluster of meanings. My wife, whose degree is in linguistics, said that she brought home to me a wonderful quotation from one of her professors of linguistics, and the quotation was, "The more linguists study a language, the more complicated the language becomes." And in a way, that's like a critical term. The more people who use the term post-dramatic or performance or absurd, the more complicated the word gets. But let me take it historically. Of course, post-dramatic is a term that has been used earlier than Hans T. Sleeman, but Hans T. Sleeman was the one who made the term important and famous, and his book therefore becomes a kind of source for thinking about the term. Even Lehmann, I'm sure you've read the book, really talks about post-dramatic in a lot of different ways. But what the term in and of itself forces you to consider is the implications of post itself. That is, if you have postmodern or post-dramatic or post anything, then that automatically implies there is something that this is post. What is it that this is after or different from? And so therefore, post-dramatic means that you assume a dramatic theater. And by and large, what Hans Thies is talking about in a dramatic theater is what many people would call a traditional literary theater. That is particularly the modern realistic theater, the theater of Ibsen and Tennessee Williams and Arthur Miller and so on. And the first major break that Lehmann talks about is the break that happened in the 1960s and 70s with the theater of the absurd, and people who moved away from traditional logic and cause and effect and realistic expectation and psychological realism into all sorts of other experimentation. Now already I already have trouble with the term then, because as people in Eastern Europe know, I think, much better than the Western Europeans and Americans do, that kind of experimentation didn't begin with the absurdists, but really goes back at least to the Russian Revolution, to Meyerhold and Evrainov and all those wonderful Polish and Czech and Bulgarian experimenters in the theater of the 1920s and 30s and 40s. Those were already what Raymond would call post-dramatic, because they were breaking away from that traditional realistic, rational cause and effect dramaturgy. So I already have trouble with the term historically, because there's always been a kind of post-dramatic element, even in the eras that Lehmann calls dramatic. On the other hand, the term is useful because it does allow us, especially Western Europeans and Americans, to call attention to the fact that for the last now 70, 80, 90 years, there has been a regular reaction in the theater against traditional, logical, realistic theater, if you call that dramatic. In a way, when even when Brecht says, my epic theater is opposed to dramatic theater, he uses that particular distinction. And does that make Brecht post-dramatic? Well, in a sense, it does, because he is reacting against the same kind of theater that Lehmann is reacting against. Certainly, we've had, at least for the last 100 years, and maybe a bit more, two very strong trends in the European theater. One, what Lehmann calls the dramatic, and that is the realistic, rational, Ibsen-style theater, and the other, what he would call the post-dramatic, and that is what began with the symbolist theater and was in the expressionist movement and the Dadaists and the surrealists, and now on today into experimentation like Robert Wilson or the Wooster Group or the Mabu Mines that you mentioned is coming to Bulgaria. All of those are clearly doing something, even though they're all very different. They're doing something that has a common enemy or opposition in what we would call dramatic theater. And it certainly, Lehmann was very important in pointing that out. I think it's just a bigger phenomenon and an older phenomenon than Lehmann is talking about. I guess then I've gone a long way from your question, but does it enrich or does it restrict the form of theater? It really kind of depends, I guess, on how you use the term. If you get too specific about exactly this is post-dramatic and this isn't, then it becomes restrictive. But if it gives you an opening to recognize a certain tendency that we might call the experimental or the avant-garde tendency in the theater, then I think it's useful and it's liberating.
Speaking about the notions which we use as theoretical instruments, I want to mention that 3 years ago, Professor Patrice Pavis was a guest in Bulgaria at the International Theatre Festival Varna Sama. And to the question, how would he define the dominating tendency in the contemporary stage, he replied that he sees that as a coexistence between two concepts born within the French and English theatre and, of course, language traditions, mise en scène and performance. In your article, you mentioned post-dramatic as stemming in a large degree from the German stage practice. I think that the concept theatricality seems a more universal one and having the potential to include different practices and traditions. But what do you think about that?
Well, I think I quite agree. More and more in the modern world, the theater is different. Theater traditions are becoming aware of each other and reacting to each other. That is 150 or so years ago, or even when the idea of modern theater studies was created by the Germans toward the end of the 19th century. At that time, the idea and the world of theater was not very complicated. That is, the Germans who really started studying theater history as we now think of it, and theater philosophy. I'm thinking of Max Herrmann and the first theater professors in Europe. And this is really not that long ago, only the end of the 19th century. They didn't think at all about non-European theater, or indeed, they didn't even think much about non-Western European theater. That was their model. And so they created a model which then, on the whole, European theater scholarship has followed ever since, with a particular idea of who are the great practitioners of that theater, and who represents the tradition. And you can still see that operating. That is, if you go to a theater season in Sofia, or in Rome, or in Berlin, or in Stockholm, what you will have is maybe half of the program, or maybe even more, will be the same people: Shakespeare, Chekhov, Brecht, maybe an American or two, maybe Tennessee Williams and Arthur Miller, probably no Bulgarians, probably no Eastern Europeans. It'll be Schiller, of course, and that's true, of course, also in Eastern Europe. If you go to Lithuania, you will find the same thing true. And then the rest of the program will be largely national playwrights and maybe a sprinkling of regional playwrights, but not very many of them. Now, so in a sense, in terms of the repertoire, we have not really moved away from the German model to begin with. They decided that Schiller and Shakespeare were the tops, and we continue to do that. I'm not disagreeing with it. I'm just saying this is the way the profession is scheduled. On the other hand, especially in Eastern Europe, early in the century, even though that the 20th century, even though that repertoire was accepted as the standard, the Eastern Europeans said, well, yes, but we don't have to keep performing that repertoire in the same way. We can use performance. They didn't always use that word, but we can use performance in order to break away from the repertoire and to let these plays speak in different, more contemporary ways. The West has not done nearly so much of that. America and England, especially, have been very conservative. So here is another way that a kind of post-dramaticism has entered the theater by way of performance. That is, and Lehmann talks about this as well. That is, you can do Shakespeare in a post-dramatic way. And the Wooster Group, for example, doing Hamlet, did what everybody would agree is a post-dramatic sort of interpretation. So again, it's very hard to say, has this restricted people or has it opened things up? I guess the general answer I would give is that artists do what excites them and interests them, and their audiences, if they're excited and interested by that, go right ahead. And sometimes they use a critical term to say this is a justification for doing it, but they don't really need the critical term. They go ahead and do what they do, I think.
I would like to return just very briefly to the beginning. Maybe you spoke quite a lot about the expansion and the enrichment of the understanding of theater when the notions of theatricality with Evreinov and performance with the 60s onwards were introduced. But can you speak a little bit about the tension between these two terms? Because, for example, I noticed sometimes in modern usage, sometimes people use performance as a way to telegraph their difference from theater.
Certainly in the United States and to some extent in England, when the term performance first was beginning to be popular, this is in the 1970s, 1980s, there was a real conflict between theater and performance. There were very angry arguments in our professional conferences about whether we should use performance or not, and whether performance was a threat to theater or not. And a little bit of that still exists, but not very much. By and large, my students don't see any conflict. They see theater and performance as terms that allow them to apply different critical methodologies. When there was a division, what the people who were opposed to performance said was that performance was denying the traditional values of theater. That is, it wanted to give up Shakespeare and Schiller and even Brecht, and instead study football games and political activities and even ritual and so on, but not. This was part of the general phenomenon in the United States, especially, that we now call the culture wars between people who were defending traditional culture and people who were seen as undermining it and bringing in all kinds of more popular but less academically respectable material. On the other hand, the people who were championing performance said the problem with traditional theater is that it's not democratic. It's an aristocratic an elite study of high art like Shakespeare and so on, and does not look at popular entertainment and popular art like circuses and clowns and so on. It sees those as inferior, and you end up ultimately arguing over matters of how was Shakespeare's Globe Theater actually built? What did it look like? Can we build a model of it? Which is not really important. The important thing is the living theater. So the performance people felt that there was a kind of a deadness and an exclusivity, a kind of narrowness in traditional theater studies. Richard Schechner at one point in the 1980s, and Schechner was a person, the real spokesman for performance study, still is in the United States. At one time he said, in 100 years, we won't study theater at all. Theater will be a dead art, and it will be only a small part of performance. Performance is the real discipline of the future. And then, of course, traditional theater scholars saw this as a threat, that Schechner wanted to get rid of them. As I say, all that has kind of disappeared now. And many universities in the country, including my own, which used to have departments of theater, I am now in a department of theater and performance. So the two terms now have pretty well grown together. But you're right. There was a tension, and a very strong one. I know people who left, who resigned from some of our academic organizations because they were getting corrupted by performance studies. But that's a historical phenomenon now, I think. And looking back, I would certainly say the concept of performance has broadened theater in two ways. It's allowed us to more objectively and significantly study non-European work, non-European performance that doesn't follow Shakespeare or the Greeks or whatever. So geographically, it's expanded us, and phenomenologically, it's expanded us because it does allow us to study popular and folk entertainment, rituals, all kinds of circus, all kinds of what we used to call quasi-theatrical or partly theatrical activities that are now under the umbrella of performance as well.
One other question which I wanted to ask you was, could you give us some examples of productions or theater artists that you've seen which have been very crucial for your understanding about the development of theater?
Yes, you mentioned that question in your email, and I must say it. I find it a very difficult one. You must remember that I'm 85 years old. I've been going to the theater often 4 or 5 nights a week for 60 years. I've seen theater truly all over the world and have loved it. And picking out certain groups or certain productions is very hard. I have puzzled over this a bit, and certainly a number of productions and a number of artists do strike me. I would say that in terms of just acting, no question, the most impressive and the most important example of that I've ever seen was Richard Kieslok, who was Grotowski's leading actor. Especially his production, The Constant Prince. I felt that he had shown me what an actor can do physically in a way that I've never seen anybody else do. Later on, he worked with Peter Brook also. So in a way, that's easy, although, of course, I've seen many, many other wonderful actors. As far as directors, of course, I think the first director that really showed me something of the potential of theater was Peter Brook. And I'm thinking of Marat Sade and Midsummer Night's Dream in particular. Those were enormously influential productions. Other very important, I think directors have had the most influence on me. Vakhtangov, Giorgio Strehler, certainly Daniel Mezguich and Patrice Chéreau in France. A number of German, Stein, not the late Peter Stein, but earlier work. Klaus Peimann, Thalheimer more recently. These are mostly Europeans. Now in the United States, what I've been most influenced by is the experimental work, the Worcester Group, the Living Theater, Richard Foreman, the Mabu Mines. These were all enormously important influences for me, and all of them had in common expanding my horizons of what theater could do, not only what it could do what it could do physically and experientially, and here we get to theatricality, I guess, but also what it could do intellectually, and of course I have to say spiritually. For me, the greatest theater is an intense spiritual phenomenon. So all of those things these groups have contributed to.
Then Professor Kарлsъn, looking at our very contemporary, very complicated situation enforced by COVID-19, how do you think that this digitalization of the arts will affect or will affect theatricality and performativity?
Well, this is a question that we're all spending a lot of time worrying about right now, and for the last year, really. When you're in the middle of a phenomenon, it's very difficult to stand back from it and be objective about what's happening. So any answer I give has to be a tentative one. My feeling is that the whole COVID experience has confirmed in me something I already believed, and that was the theater is a live art, that Zoom theater is not theater. There is something about not only you and the actor being alive and breathing in the same space, but I mean, Cheeselock would be a wonderful example of that. I had to be in the room with him. But also being with an audience, that the collective response to the performance, which any actor is aware of, and it is a two-way matter. That is, the audience helps, obviously, is a co-creator of the experience. None of that have we found a way to manage in digitally, and I don't think it's possible. I do think it's possible to create a digital theater. I haven't seen any really successful examples of it yet. And in a way, maybe we have already found out how to do that, which is to make films. I mean, film is an art. It's a very different art from theater. I haven't yet seen, of course, it's very early, digitalization being able to create effects that are anything like the really great work, great experiences that I've had in the live theater and in the film. It's sort of in between and hasn't really achieved a lot in either one of them. Thank God for the internet. I mean, it makes possible what we're doing right now. I've been teaching a class that has, I teach it, I'm here in upstate New York, but I have students in Europe. I have a couple of students in China. I have a student in Brazil. This is wonderful. We're all able to talk, and I recognize that value of it. But from an aesthetic and artistic point of view, I do not yet see that this last year's experience has laid the foundations for any kind of profound advancement in theater or performance. I hope I'm mistaken. People are very ingenious. I don't see it. I live for the day that I can get back in the real theater again with real people.
Thank you very much for this talk. I think this answer is a good finish of our discussion.